So when are we supposed to start?
I think I was just turned 101, so I think if no one objects, I'll go ahead and start the show.
Okay. Thank you for the
Oh,
invitational.
well, thank you for joining us, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon for the Southern Historical Association's virtual program revolving around the 90th anniversary of W.E.B. Du Bois's work, Black Reconstruction in America. I'm Dr. Robert Greene II, Assistant Professor of History at Claflin University, and I'm honored and privileged to bring to you today this wonderful panel discussion about Black Reconstruction. And right before we went live, we were just discussing the fact that this book is an incredibly lengthy work of history. In particular, I can remember going to check the book out as an undergrad student, thinking, oh, I've never heard of this book by W.E.B. Du Bois before. This should be interesting. Then I went to the library to get it and realized this is going to be very interesting, seeing how long the book was. But it was an enriching experience for me, and I hope that this discussion today will be enriching for everyone here this afternoon. Also, I want to say, in my other role as president of the African American Intellectual History Society, the second issue of Global Black Thought coming out later this year, our journal will actually be about Black Reconstruction in America as well. So be on the lookout for that too. Now, today's panel discussion is going to be a great one, and I want to introduce our panelists, starting, of course, with Dr. Hilary Green, who is the James B. Duke Professor of History, Africana Studies, excuse me, at Davidson College. Her most recent work is Unforgettable Sacrifice, How Black Communities Remembered the Civil War, a remarkable work of history about not just memory, but about how Black communities have kept alive a more accurate and interesting portrayal of the American Civil War. Up next, we have Dr. Michael Fitzgerald, who is Professor Emeritus, whose most recent book is Reconstruction in Alabama, From Civil War to Redemption in the Cotton South. We are very happy to have Dr. Fitzgerald joining us this afternoon. And finally, Dr. Alaina Roberts, who is an award-winning historian who studies the intersection of Black and Native American life from the Civil War to the modern day. Her most recent work is I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. She has also been published extensively in a variety of publications, both scholarly and public-facing too. So we are privileged and thrilled to welcome all three of these wonderful scholars on this afternoon. And what we'll be doing is asking each scholar to talk a bit about the influence of Black Reconstruction on their careers, on their research, on their writing. And then, of course, we will turn it over to the audience for a Q&A. So please be thinking about your questions as we go forward. So I wish to start our discussion with Dr. Hilary Green. So Dr. Green, tell us a bit about how Black Reconstruction has influenced your career and why it's so important to your work as a scholar of the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction eras.
I will say this, this book is massive, it's lengthy, but also reflected why this is so instrumental. Because Black history wasn't really viewed as something that was worthy of the American profession. And one of the things, while it's long, I keep on thinking about a 1921 telegram that Anna Julia Cooper sends to Du Bois in terms of why this book is so matters so much. And that will help me get to why I think it's so monumental. It seems to me that the tragic era written by Claude Bowers should be answered fully, ably, finally, and gain it seems to me thou art the man. Take it up seriously through the crisis and let us buy up 10,000 copies to be distributed broadcast through the land. Will you do it? Answer. He writes this thick book, and I think also too reminds me what's this book, Leon Litwack's book, Been in the Storm So Long, Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction, and now Manisha Sinha's book on another type of question, the rise and fall of Reconstruction. He gives us this lengthy treatise because he's responding to the field and its inattention. And he centers Black life in its magnificentness and coming in, you see the whirlwinds, but he gives you state by state, region by region. And his labor analysis, which I found really interesting, that's not what I picked up on. It was his public school analysis. Because he was very clear, and I had to say in my writing my work, when people talk about failure, I'm like, we still have public schools. Public schools were created. It went from illegal to legal, enshrined in state constitutions, budgets created, whole new bureaucracies created. And this is not because white people felt it was okay to educate Black children. So where's that intersection between communities and the states? People create new constitutions and embedded education in the state. And reading that then influenced authors that I really used in my research, James Anderson, John Hope Franklin, Hilary Williams, and others who do education. This is where that chapter is foundational because he was writing this in the 30s. And what the scholars on the Dunning School is Henry Swint that's calling it a mistake in 41. And he's doing it much earlier and giving those foundational pieces. But he's also a scholar who's working in the middle of the Jim Crow era and where he knows it's going to be read by others. So he has lengthy quotes for a reason. You can't do research if those archives are closed. You can't find voices of the past if you don't know who they are. And it gave me a jumping off point to go forward. So for me, the chapter on the founding of public school is so important. The other chapter I've been coming back to another history of education, is the general strike. I'm looking at the general strike chapter and by focusing on labor as, okay, we know it's a labor strike and it's a movement of labor. What happens when we look at institutions of higher ed that then went from educating Southern white elites to educating future officers of the Confederacy? In particular, the University of Alabama, Davidson, all the schools that stayed open. What does resistance look like? What does labor look like? When does the strike actually begin in those places? Because they had to bide their time. And it allowed me to think about Reconstruction more broadly on these college campuses, that you have people who are upholding the state and other people who are waiting for freedom. And when they have that strike, when does that look like? And that brings you to a different types of chronology of the long emancipation. And so for me, Black Reconstruction is a place to read because Du Bois did it others and we're still catching up. But he gave us some nuggets to go forward. And that's how I think for me, I turn to that book as well as the other books I mentioned. When I think about a topic, I'm like, what did Du Bois have to say about this? What did Litwack have to say? So I'm always like, what Du Bois? And sometimes I disagree. And so one of the things about the limitations and where sometimes I disagree with Du Bois is Black women are background. And I'm like, where are Black women in this? Where are they in the schooling? Where are they in leadership building? And because of my work on institutions of higher ed and my book on memory, where is the Reconstruction North? Where is the Black North who are laborers too? This is a Southern story, and I'm thinking about those who are on the Pennsylvania-Maryland line, those border states. Where do they fit in? And where do Black working class Northerners fit in to this labor struggle and history of Black Reconstruction? Because education wasn't a given even in the Northern states. And I think about the Pennsylvania counties that I write about, they're still education's not afforded to them to the 1880s, 1890s sometimes. And even then, it's segregated, even though on the books they're supposed to be integrated. So where are those struggles about finding public schools? We look at a rural North and these inconsistencies there too. And where can you see a greater struggle that's now more national and more international in times? But for me, this is usually the starting off point, and Du Bois and his response to Anna Julia Cooper. And it's the other thing I like about Du Bois. He listened to a strong Black woman, and when she gave him marching orders, he did answer this fully, adequately, and kept on going, because who's going to anger Anna Julia Cooper? That's all I have to start off with.
Thank you so much, and you're absolutely right. I'm glad that you mentioned that 1921 letter, because that's a really important part of his story too. So, Dr. Fitzgerald, a lot of your work has centered around Reconstruction in the Deep South, especially in Alabama. So could you talk a bit about how Du Bois is really approaching the Reconstruction era in the Deep South in particular? Because I have to note, as someone who's based in South Carolina, we're thrilled that we get a whole chapter to ourselves.
Right.
But he does kind of divide the book into different sections of the South. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about that.
And the thoughts about what specifically he did with Alabama in the Deep South?
Yes.
Okay. Uh, well, to set this up in broad terms, it seems to me he's less interested in Alabama and the other states where African Americans are not a majority.
Hmm.
He's much more interested in South Carolina and Mississippi and Louisiana. And he because the emphasis of the book is so much Black empowerment, he wants to look at the places where the Black proletariat and their leadership have more influence. And I think that you could argue that that's a limitation because most of the South isn't like that. And like in Alabama, as he does in fact point out, nobody African American gets elected to state office at any point, and the leadership, the Black leadership, is obliged to compromise all over the place because Black people are 45% of the population. So that's a different, that's a different kind of dynamic. Now, in terms of talking about his influence on my own work, I guess I would say that well, I have actual evidence here. This is my undergraduate or early grad school copy of the book. And it got some mileage. I got some use out of it. Although I must say it didn't fare well in reading it lately in the new century, as the bindings are now half a century old. But all right. Um, so what did I get out of the book? I think that in terms of my own intellectual influence as somebody working in the field, I think it's mostly because Foner's work came out as I was doing my graduate studies, and it came out just after I finished. And so much of Foner's approach is gesturing back in the direction of Du Bois, his politics, his emphasis on the working class and the general strike idea. And so it's kind of like, you read Litwack, you read Foner, and it kind of comes in that way. I'd also mention, though, that for Foner, it's pretty striking because, like, the dedication of Nothing But Freedom is to Du Bois. And you can kind of see that. And I also should say that Du Bois did me a favor in another respect, which is I stole the title for one of my books from nearly the last sentence of his book or whatever. So, okay. So what do we want to say about this book in the literature? Okay, the first thing is I went to my bookshelf and I just grabbed everything off the shelves that I thought might refer to Du Bois and just checked the index to see what they're saying about him. And you have never seen such a chorus of praise. Um, this 2015 historiographic essays have terms like magisterial, flawed jewel, the first great account of the period. On all of my bookshelves, I found one book that had a critical sentence. So what 90-year-old book could you come up with in any field of U.S. history that has that kind of unanimous praise? That's an extraordinary accomplishment. And so I want to talk a little bit about what people are so impressed with. Um, the first thing is that people admire Du Bois himself. Major figure in American history, major figure in African American history, incredible length of activism and lifespan, um, model of engaged scholarship, and his intellectual attainments. Historians respond positively to that, and they and most of us, I think, would identify with a lot of what Du Bois stood with. There's more. Um, that's one thing. Second thing, um, that last chapter, the chapter on the historiography, there are few things that are 90 years old that you sit there and read a chapter and you're agreeing with almost every point. Because his critique of the turn of the century literature does not grow old. The accusation is that it's premised on white supremacist beliefs. And since that's so clearly true, and he just states that if you approach this with different premises, the history is going to look different. You're just sitting there nodding the whole way through. And so You know, and if you look specifically at it, the the book I know well is Fleming's History of Reconstruction Alabama. It's about the same length as Du Bois's book, and every word about it, he almost understates how bad Fleming is, because Fleming is a Klan admirer, and Du Bois doesn't even make that point. He just but what he says is damning enough. So yeah. Um, and I think Elaine France did a review. Elaine Parsons did a review a few years ago that talks about that set of essays on the Dunning School, and she sort of points out that historians of Reconstruction tend towards self-congratulation, and this particular chapter resonates with that, because we all feel like he's sanctifying what we're doing. Okay. Another thing about the book that I think is very influential and very important. How am I doing for time? Okay. Um, the opening lines, or among the opening lines, I'm going to tell this story as though Negroes were ordinary human beings, he writes, well aware that this is going to limit the audience. And I think that everyone, everyone kind of, you know, if you look at Foner's book, he's explicit that that's what he's doing. And so that approach, that African Americans are the major players in Reconstruction, that's useful. That people are into that. Du Bois's general strike idea, as an explanation of Confederate defeat, it's all over the place in the literature. The literature spends a lot of time on refugees, a lot of time on Black soldiers. He tends towards a vigorous assertion of this idea that this withdrawal and bestowal of Black labor decided the war. That's a strong assertion, but a lot of historians sort of pursue that argument, and you can find it in the Freedom Papers Project. You can find it in Ira Berlin's old debate with McPherson, all that stuff on Black military service. It's all right there. So the Du Bois, the general strike idea, and actually in a sentence or two, Du Bois goes back and talks about it in terms of thinking about slavery itself as a general strike, and African American work habits as part of that. And I think that's actually pretty good. Um, and so, in just the premises of his work, his leftish sympathies, his general sense of what the motor of change is, and his emphasis on the Black working class, that's likely to remain influential in the future, unless the profession is so purged in the coming years that none of us are likely to be in it. Universities could change. We will see what comes now. Okay, so what are the criticisms? Well, this is not a work-based. He had a team of researchers working for him. So he got a big grant. He had 4 or 5 people helping him do the research. But it's not really based on manuscript research. He couldn't really go to Southern archives and spend lots of time there. And that's not what he's about doing here. And so he has to rely on the Dunning School sources that he critiques so severely for his factual narrative. And in the places where the factual narrative that they lay out is wrong, he has trouble finding it. And the best example of that I could come up with, he has a paragraph on the Union League movement. Now, it's a topic I know pretty well. One paragraph where he basically says Fleming and the Dunning School had it wrong. Well, that's right, but there's a whole lot else you could say about these local grassroots clubs. What's happening as you allow people who've been enslaved their whole lives actually address public issues. It's actually an interesting topic and the labor implications of it. And actually, in fact, part of the argument that I made was that sharecropping is that the shift from gang labor sharecropping is part of one of the things that's propelling this mass movement. And sharecropping almost doesn't come up in this book. He doesn't really talk about it at all. So there are things that are missing here. Even I noticed that women are not in this book. Okay. Yep. The only women who turn up here in any numbers are actually the Yankee schoolmarms that he so admires. So that's kind of an interesting, but you know, you got to draw on the existing literature, and there just isn't much. Um, how should I stop now? How long is this a good place to stop?
Yeah, I
There's
think
more I
this
can
is a
say.
good place to stop. I think we'll come back to you doing the Q&A for sure, though. But this is a good place for us to
Fair
finish
enough.
Dr. Roberts. Yes, but those are some really important points you've raised, and I'm actually excited to go to Dr. Roberts next because a lot of your work deals with the relationship of African Americans to the land in particular, which is something that also comes up in Black Reconstruction here or there. And so I'm curious, Dr. Roberts, in terms of how Black Reconstruction has been influential on your work, especially this idea of thinking about the Black American relationship to the land and land ownership too.
Well, I do not have the long established relationship that Dr. Greene and Dr. Fitzgerald have with this work directly anyway. Obviously, the fields of Civil War and Reconstruction have been so influenced by it. But I really only just read the full 735 pages 2 weeks ago for this event. And I was happy to have that opportunity because I feel like we're in a moment right now where I really needed to see a Black scholar confronting the status quo, kind of using his work to fight a battle that seemed so large, so overwhelming, because that's what us historians and really all Americans are doing in this country right now. So it was sad, yes, but also heartening in a way to kind of go back to 1935 and remember the battles that have been fought before and won slowly over time with a lot of effort from different coalitions. So because this was my first time reading from the very beginning, this was the first time I read. My copy had the introduction by David Levering Lewis, a historian at Rutgers, and Dr. Lewis talks a little about some of the books on Reconstruction written by African Americans before Du Bois that I was unfamiliar with, like monograms and articles by, I wanted to make sure I got them right, Alrutheus Taylor, G. David Houston, A.E. Perkins, and Mason J. Brewer. And so I kind of wondered to myself, why was this particular book kind of chosen by Du Bois as the one to be kind of held up as like the classic in his time? Like it received more attention actually than I realized. But then also nowadays, it kind of along with Foner's book is kind of held up. And, as Dr. Greene brought out, of course, Du Bois had famous friends like Anna Julia Cooper kind of encouraging him and platforming him. He also had his own huge platform because of his status as, a writer and orator. But I think also so much of it is because of what the book is meant to do. And so as Dr. Fitzgerald just brought out, it's not meant to, really kind of be an archival deep dive, bringing up, new sources no one's ever seen before. It's meant to reframe. And it's really kind of giving this intervention to a historiography shaped with a very strong hand by, a racist, by William Dunning. And so the points of the book I'm not going to go into because we've kind of already hit on a lot of the main arguments. But what was more interesting to me as I read was that this argument isn't made on the basis of new sources, that really kind of reframing already present sources and narratives can offer an important counter to not only a historiographic moment, but also for this topic, a very real way that policy was playing out. And so I, as a historian, really relate to the way that framing can do a lot of work, that synthesis can do a lot of work. And so I was thinking about how, I don't know, 5 years ago, a decade ago, certainly when I was in grad school, synthetic was kind of a dirty word. Like, oh, you're writing a synthetic history? Like, that's not real history. But in the past few years, like historians writing synthetic histories like, Ned Blackhawk, like Kathleen Duval have won huge awards, being honored by historians, but also the public. And so my first book, I've been here all the while, brought together my own archival research as well as family history to make an argument about Reconstruction that connected Native American and African American historiographies. But in order to really kind of assert, my findings or my points about Oklahoma, formerly known as Indian Territory, I was using and relying on the foundational work of other scholars who came before me, like Ty Miles, Celia Nayer, Freya Yarbrough, Barbara Krauthammer, Claudia Sant. And this is clearly not me saying my book is on the same level as Du Bois's, but saying that his use of multiple lenses to encourage his reader to rethink how they previously viewed this period of time and the literature about it, I think is important for a historian to kind of take as a lesson. Of course, he makes clear that, if you don't already believe that Black people are human and capable just as white people are, then there's no point really. But the reframing, I think, is kind of a great way to think about the kinds of contributions historians can make. And so as I read this book with the eyes of a scholar of the Black experience, but also of the Native American experience, I was thinking of a few things. And so, I do have a few more maybe critiques than the others. And I don't see this as kind of whataboutism, like, why didn't he include this? He should have done this, but rather what maybe we can take today as something to think about and to, use as we think through Reconstruction. So Du Bois mentions Native Americans only a few times, and he does so in the vein that is pretty common in the period of the early 1900s. So he references a kind of general knowledge that there has been some sexual mixture between African Americans and Native Americans in North America, leading to people who are mixed race. And around the same time, Carter G. Woodson wrote, one of the longest unwritten chapters in the history of the United States is that treating of the relationships of the Negroes and the Indians. And so there is some knowledge at this time that there was interaction between these groups that was positive, like the Wampanoags or the Narragansetts taking in Black runaways or marrying free Black people. The Seminoles is also kind of well known. And also in negative ways, like what I study, Native Americans functioning as slave catchers or as enslavers of Black people. But I was a little surprised that the exploitation of Native labor is like kind of not part of his analysis of labor, of power, of democracy. But that's because in this text, Native Americans' primary role is to be absent, because in their supposed absence, land is free. And so this is the word he uses, free, many times. Land is free to be argued over by various political parties with regard to whether slavery is allowed there. Land is free to be given or not to freed slaves. Land is free to be restored to former slaveholders, and that then acts as a symbol of the lack of resources available to poor whites, or the birth of a new labor system that is very similar to the old labor system. And so in my book, I discuss some of the Black leaders in the Reconstruction era who are going west to settle themselves or to build communities in places like Kansas or Indian Territory or Nebraska, who are advocating for Oklahoma to enter Union as an all-Black state. And when we think about these men and the way they're talking about this opportunity for Black people, Native Americans are also absent often in those conversations, or they function as foils, as people who are supposedly too uncivilized to be productive on their own land. And so it's okay that land should be transferred to white Americans or Black Americans. And so what I saw in some of what Du Bois was saying in his arguments for Black humanity and Black civilization was this kind of similar discussion about Black productivity, about kind of willingness to fit into this kind of capitalistic model, like saying this is why we need to believe that African Americans were capable, and why we need to see that they were playing an important part in the Civil War becoming over slavery, and then these land allotments that were given temporarily in some parts of the South. And so one of his key arguments is Black agency. But when we really look closely at what Black agency is doing and what it's becoming a part of, indirectly at least, it's becoming our part of Native American dispossession. And so when we think about where this land is coming from, it's very much not free. But that's because this is one of the few ways that African Americans have available to them to provide for their families, to strike out anew. And that's why, settler colonialism and white supremacy are so insidious, because they can be co-opted by us all, sometimes without our realizing it. And when I was reading this book, I was talking to my friend Khalil Johnson, who's at Wesleyan. Shout out to Khalil. He's going to have a wonderful book coming out soon that ties together the long history of Black and Native education and their relationship to U.S. empire. I was kind of going to him because he is far more grounded in 20th century historiographies of Black and Native relations than I am. And so I asked him, what can we really expect from Du Bois in this period of time? Like, is it unrealistic to think that he should know or would know that this idea of Western settlement is kind of dangerous? And his response was, no, it's not unrealistic. Actually, Du Bois did know what he was doing was wrong. And he reminded me of an article that Kyle Mays wrote in the American Indian Quarterly, where he's talking about Du Bois's relationship with a few Native scholar activists and leaders. So he is aware of their struggles. It's just that, he is one of our kind of great Black scholars who could see imperialism and colonialism in other countries and other spaces. But when it came to the United States, that took a backseat to Black progress. And so that was common for the day. It's not like he's like uniquely horrible or something, but it's, I think today, something that we can counter, that we can do something about. And a lot of scholars are. A lot of scholars are looking to Reconstruction. There's, an amazing scholarship developing, but also in labor and slavery earlier than Reconstruction, looking at these parallels between Native and Black experiences, but also the way they're very much intertwined and how studying them together gives us a much better understanding of labor, of the possibility of Native and Black people in these spaces, and the development of exploitation in North America. So that's kind of the beauty of history, right? That we are changing and intertwining new and more histories as we go on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for that. That was a great analysis of the book as well. And what I'd like to do now is to go in the Q&A, and we can do this one of two ways. Folks can either use the react button to raise their hands and ask a question, or you can put the questions in the chat. As a matter of fact, we have one from Catherine Leonard right now. This is a great question. Let me go ahead and ask it to you guys, and all the panelists can respond to it. I've taught parts of the General Strike chapter, various classes on Civil War and Reconstruction. But I'm curious, on this read, members of the panel found others, if on this read, members of the panel found other sections of the book that could be useful for undergraduate classroom discussion in our current historical moment.
Yes. So one of the chapters, other than the general strike, is the public school chapter. I use that a lot. And then also his takedown at the end chapter about the propaganda of history. But the public school one in particular is because that's one of the great misconceptions my students come into my undergrad classes with, that there is no positives that come out of here, that nothing survived. And when he goes through and then we couple that with actual state constitution sections, they start to think like, oh, wait, we're still dealing with the same system that got founded in 1867, 68, 69, and 70. I'm like, yeah, it hasn't changed. So if that persisted and having that chapter there, and also it's the first time they actually read the chapter that was a positive about Black education, because they haven't read Heather's book, Self-Taught. They haven't read any of the other stuff. They get introduced to my class. So this is one of those teachable, non-jargony, and also the least political. Anytime you talk about labor, your students are like, well, he's advocating socialism. Like, no, we're not going to go there. Education, they understand that. So that Marxist lens does not skew how they interpret it because of the public founding of the public school. So that's the one I use a lot for teaching, especially in undergrad classes of history of education, that is still beneficial and more productive. And students are like, why is this the first time I'm reading about this? And this person's doing it in 1935.
I was going to comment in terms of something to use teaching. I think the second to last chapter, I'm trying to remember, but Back Towards Slavery, that has a discussion of what things are like in 1935 and what was lost with the defeat of Reconstruction. And I sort of thought that just a discussion of how things were in the South in 1935, coming from somebody who knows it well, is a nice short summary of what the Jim Crow South felt like. And so I sort of thought that would actually work. It doesn't hit the themes of the book tremendously, but it's just an interesting piece. Plus that last chapter, of course, on the propaganda of history is great.
I found chapter 7 and 8 very interesting because I like to talk a lot in my classes about kind of about class, but like not making it very theoretical, but just like, why today? Like, do poor white people vote against their own interests? Like, why do we not have, everyone rising up against these billionaires, like who have a ridiculous amount of money that no one should ever have? And so going back in time, I think, to show this is not new. Like, this has actually been a very kind of long-standing issue, and there are forces directly working against cross-racial alliances. Has worked in the past, like even not using Du Bois necessarily, but now I will kind of incorporate that into this discussion that I like to have in my African American history classes.
Go ahead, please.
Well, to follow up on the poor white issue, I was sort of struck that with the absence in Du Bois's book of the poor white issue comes up with Andrew Johnson, his critical take on Andrew Johnson. It comes up at other points in terms of the racial wage and the uses of white people as enforcers for the system. But I was sort of thinking that one of the things that's not in the book that probably should be is there is a unionist subculture in the mountain north, I mean the mountain south. And they have their own motives, and they're not just economic. There's a real distaste for secession among significant numbers of the white South. And a lot of them wind up in the Republican column for a while, unionists in the couple years after the war. And so if you're talking about the fate of Reconstruction, I know it's Black Reconstruction in America, but if you're talking about the fate of Reconstruction, you ought to talk about their coalition partners a little.
No, I think that's actually a perfectly fair and reasonable point. Something that is, I think, another good critique of the book. And I just wanted to add to the question that Catherine raised is teaching at an HBCU in South Carolina, my students often find the chapter on the Black proletariat in South Carolina particularly interesting because in our state, there's still a lot of work that has to be done in teaching Reconstruction in K through 12. And so many students are not aware of that Reconstruction history. But also the propaganda of history is very helpful to my students, especially in courses like Historian's Craft, in terms of thinking and conceptualizing, well, what exactly is the purpose of history? How do we do history? And why does history actually matter in some sense? Those are the two chapters I find to be particularly useful. Are there any other questions from the audience this afternoon? This has been a great discussion so far. Any other questions from folks in the room?
I feel like there's so few people we could just like all have our cameras on and just like discuss it.
I mean, that's the thing is I think this book is such a rich book of history that we could be here all day, and there's so much to say. So, Khalil, I see you unmuted yourself. Go ahead, please.
So I guess Du Bois always tethered his intellectual work to social work and political work and the necessity that he understood to shape public opinion, because without shaping public opinion, it was impossible to shape the law. And without the capacity to vote, it was impossible to shape, society. So, and without schools, it was impossible to produce the people who could to both participate politically, but also shape public opinion. So I guess as we're in this moment of retrenchment, that seems in some ways very reminiscent to the attacks against Reconstruction, like as a historical document, as a historical person, does Du Bois and Black Reconstruction hold any insights for how we might combat this moment politically, intellectually, socially, and as educators and historians?
I'll take a stab at that because one of the things I find telling is the propaganda of history we're seeing in real time. We're seeing the effects of that chapter and not teaching this moment, even though we're in the 160th, and now we're getting of Reconstruction because we're in 25 now, so we're now entering the 160th anniversary of Reconstruction, and I yet have people who are like arguing this political moment, they're like, I don't understand why the 14th Amendment is so bad, and question. I'm like, oh no, no, no. You're gonna read all of it. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about what it is, because this is where he does with others. He puts out what the stakes were and the overturning of it. And also, too, some historians who are complicit in this moment, too, and talk about the propaganda, because we haven't really talked about the continued people who are moving against some of that work. And so for me, Black Reconstruction also becomes a way to say, not only did people, it's just not a 21st century thing. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois, everyone else came back and were calling out scholars. They understood the stakes because 35 is close to the 75th anniversary of the Civil War. So it's also around the anniversary. And they never divorce it because they understand what happens when you allow propaganda and the absence of teaching this. And the absence of having that and shaping policy, you can have blocks on anti-lynching. You can have blocks on there and people being complicit and allowing for retrenchment. And I think in many ways, it's still timely because he spoke out. And while there's some problems with the books and what he's doing, this isn't new and it's not a new fight. And also to the other thing with him, he's part of a larger Black history movement. And so A.A. Taylor, Luther P. Jackson, and all this. What happens if we build coalitions with one another to speak out as historians, not from our desk, but for actually saying, we're in this fight together. What is who are the Du Boises among us? Who are our coalitions amongst us? And how do we push against this moment rather than putting our heads in the sand? And that's one of the things I like about Du Bois. He spoke up, even though he's not writing his World War I book, as Chad Williams reminds us. He's writing this book first and then shelves the other stuff. He's just that person. And that's where he understood his power and voice and what he has that PhD for.
Only Du Bois could delay writing an 800-page book by writing a 700-plus page book, but I digress. But no, I think Dr. Johnson's question is a really important one. I would also add to that when we think about Black Reconstruction in America's long history, one of the ways that it kind of came back in the public consciousness was back in the 1960s during the civil rights and Black Power movements. And to your question, I think it's worth noting that the Black Panther Party had this book as part of their reading list that people had to go through as they were reading books and joining the Black Panther Party. This is one of the books that they had on their list of books to read. Doctors Roberts or Fitzgerald would like to chime in as well.
The like what we witnessed in kind of 2020, 2021, like all of these Black and white people taking to the streets and then changes in various industries, etc., was kind of thrilling for me because, like, for many reasons, I was not kind of politically involved when I was younger. Thank you, religion. And so the like reading Du Bois and seeing that then when those allies got kind of tired and like got over like hearing about like Black rights and the killing of Black people by police, etc., it was like, oh yes, like this is a cycle that's been going on and this is not new, and there are like we kind of have to persevere through it, and like we have to get ourselves kind of amped up again to fight it, and then also like pull back in the people who have always been allies and will always be allies, but then also we have to have the majority people because this is the majority white country. Like we have to find ways, I think, to get them to wake up too. And that doesn't make it any less depressing, I guess, or scary or hard, but seeing that this is a cycle was sort of weirdly comforting to me. That if we could do it once, we can do it again, and we've done it more than once, actually, sadly.
And I have kind of a different response to it. I sort of think in terms of the creation of this book in terms of Du Bois's life, and as an older person, I sort of think in terms of life stages. And my sense is that Du Bois, at the time he decides to write this book, is kind of being pushed out of the leadership of the NAACP by Roy Wilkins, Walter White, the younger generation. And I think that another thing he's doing here is looking for a way to be productive as his leadership in the movement is declining. And so what he decides as a good scholar is what's the most urgent intellectual task I can come up with. And I think that this this is that creation, and it's a reasonable thing to do. So there are different ways to engage with the issues of your time.
Absolutely. Any additional question from the audience this afternoon? Because I have a question burning in the back of my mind, but I want to go to the audience first for additional questions. So that was a great question, Dr. Johnson. Thank you for that.
Rob, it's all you.
Well, I wanted to ask a brief question about something that the book is, I think, one of the things the book's arguably best known for, which is Du Bois's use of Marxism and Marxist theory in the book. And how do you think it impacts Black Reconstruction? Do you think it helps or hinders the book, or do you just simply see it as a different way of interpreting the Reconstruction era?
I would just say, as someone who had to read E.P. Thompson, and I just remember, Marxism was a part of the historical profession, and a different way. One of the things I appreciate by his lens is when we go to working class struggle and what historians do, and he's one of the few Black historians that are drawn on in a conscious way. There's others who try to dip in and out, but I actually liked it because of the labor and forcing us to think about different labor struggles at the time, and reminded in the 1930s when he wrote this, one of the greatest civil rights activist group was the Communist Party of the United States. I'm thinking about Scottsboro. I'm thinking about there.
Mhm.
So for me, his analysis coupled with, because I used to live in Alabama and teach in Alabama, Hammer and Hoe by Robin D.G. Kelly.
Right.
Alabama Press had copies of it all the time. I couldn't keep 5 copies in my office because my students, once they read Black Reconstruction, they went to Hammer and Hoe. I had to give them a copy. So this is where sometimes when we talk about labor and marginalized people on labor, it still fits within that time frame and period, but there's some parts of his analysis it falls away from because Marxism as a theoretical lens doesn't always fit nicely with everything. But on the labor struggle, counterpart labor, it fits within that for me. So for me, it can be seen in limitation of some chapters, but I think the greatest limitation now is a misunderstanding what Marxist historiography looks like. So my students have no clue what that is. They're like, is it socialist? And I have to break down all the things because it has come out of vogue. But when I understand it as a labor history and different things and talks about in terms of labor, they have a better appreciation of it and see different insights and how different lenses come in. And that's when I usually get at who were the women, and they start raising out who's missing from the conversation, is because that's how they see the limitations of what his approach is.
Couple things just in passing. One is, yes, Robin Kelly's book is brilliant. I love the book. This book, I think that the emphasis on class is an abiding thing in the literature and dates well. Maybe the terminology might be a problem. I think David Levitin Lewis in the biography kind of pointed out that uh, there's a lot of the dictatorship of this, the dictatorship of that, dictatorship of labor, dictatorship of the military, and dictatorship of the proletariat is kind of in the back of your mind as you're reading that, and that sounds funny to us now, and it's very clearly a response to the time. And so you could find so terminology. The other thing is that there are whole big hunks in this book that are talking about the labor movement of the North and the first international, and and I think in long sections of speech is quoted. And I sort of think that space would have been better spent talking about what was happening with whites in the South, some of whom are drawn to support Reconstruction for a while. So that would be that his emphasis, his interest in Marxism takes him into spending a lot of time on stuff that's not that germane.
And I would add the other thing is this is where Appalachia would have been in there, but particularly then you would have to talk about white and black Appalachia
Right.
and having that struggle and what those coalitions look like in terms of that regional one, I think would have added some complications to his argument, but it was nice to have.
Is that an answer?
Yeah, oh, that's more than an answer, though. Thank you for that. Any other questions from the audience before we close up shop this afternoon? This has been a great conversation.
Let's see. Is there anything else?
Can I raise a question as a
Please, by
practical
all
one of
means, go
my
ahead.
colleagues? As we're in the point of books being banned again, what is our game plan for when this book becomes banned again? And what is our effort to the field? Because I still think it has meaning because it's lasting power, but I know I didn't read it until college and I read Litwack first because my parents had a copy. So I'm thinking about all the books I read before I read this one. They're hefty, but how do we convince people to pick it up in the banned book era that we're in? And
Selections. Selections. One thing he does, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the book is because the evidence is scanted by the Dunning School people. He wants to have you see the evidence that supports his interpretation. So there are long segments of speeches quoted. There are long, and so it's not the most accessible work in the world. It makes sense in context in terms of what he's doing, but you choose a lot of it is passionate. A lot of it is really interesting in terms of just as an emotional experience reading it. Is that a is that a response?
I would say so, definitely. I think to add to that, I think sometimes with books that get banned, that sometimes makes them even more popular because folks are suddenly intrigued and want to see what's in this banned book. But I think you're right. It's such a number one, it's a hefty work, and number two, I think in terms of Du Bois's works that are known to the general public, the best known one is Souls of Black Folk. And then after that, I think a lot of people you have to kind of remind them that he also wrote Dark Water. He wrote Black Reconstruction. He wrote Dusk of Dawn, etc. There are so many Du Bois books that are worthy of reading, and so many Du Bois books that, as you just mentioned, could get banned in the very near future. So I think you're right about developing a game plan. Um, and speaking of game plans, there is a question in the chat from Caleb McDaniel. I'm thankful that he asked this question. He says, "Thank you for the rich and timely reflection. I'm curious about the panel's view on the concept of abolition democracy, which Benicia Sinha has emphasized. What work does the concept do for Du Bois and for you in this idea of abolition democracy?"
I thought it was kind of a cumbersome term, actually. I I I I found it took a while for me to puzzle out what he meant because in some sections it's kind of a synonym for radical. Um, I don't know.
yeah, I it's one of the things in there because and also too, this is I think talk about activists because I'm thinking about the Angela Davis book that takes that title for her publication, what she's talking about abolition democracy and I think it goes back to some of the things that Alaina talked about of reframing of all of our notions of what do we do. Are we thinking about capitalism? Are we thinking about democracy? That they're replacing. What does more a radical reimagining? And I always link it to some of the things that Kelly did, like in Freedom Dreams. How do you push people to move forward beyond where they are? And and it's one of those things he develops, but not as satisfactory, but that term gets currency among other activists who are thinking about how do we reimagine a world that is so messed up where we are now. And so is it that I think is there, but I think it's something that I have seen, but I haven't seen a lot of scholars of historians pick it up. I'd rather see it more in the activist side, and the more the abolitionist scholarship is picking up that more and more. And I wonder if that's something that we, Manisha does bring it up a little bit, but is that something we as a field should reinterrogate and bring in? What does this frame theoretical understanding mean going forward?
No, thanks for those responses. And Dr. Roberts, you've had a very I can see the gears turning for
Yeah,
you. Do you
yeah,
have
I was
anything
kind
you
of
want to
wondering.
add as well?
But turn on your sound.
I mean, I'm just not hmm, I'm maybe not as versed as thinking about these things. Like I haven't, thought and rethought about them, or maybe had as many years to talk to people about them. But in response to Hillary's question before, I'm just like, I would love a book TikToker to just pick up Black Reconstruction and just kind of like put it simply for like me and for other people, because like I was scared away from Black Reconstruction by like the Marxism in it and by like the theoretical words. Like I was like, I'm not smart enough to understand this. Like I'm just gonna let people interpret this for me. Um, and I think that's kind of how they wrote books like back in the day too. That it was, kind of you have to be smart enough to understand this, and we're not necessarily writing in the most plain way. Whereas I think now it's more of a drive to write like accessibly for other academics outside of the field as well as non-academics. Um, so yeah, there are so many nuggets that like I still need to reread this, I think, to maybe fully understand.
Can I suggest that actually the chapter in this biography of Du Bois um, is actually the circumstances, highlighting the circumstances under which this is written and kind of summarizing some of the debates surrounding it. I thought it was very interesting, and kind of some of the big themes there kind of laid out nicely in terms of what people are saying about it at the time.
Great.
And I would add Chad Williams's book about his failed history and working through failure, because it also explains why he goes to Black Reconstruction in various ways. And my students found that very interesting in reading that section, then reading parts of Black Reconstruction. But I teach a W.E.B. Du Bois class on major
Did you really?
thinkers, so I get to
What's
dive
the
deep in
biography you mentioned? It's a biography?
Chad Williams, The Wounded World. So for me, I get to do a deep dive all the time. And Levering, Lewis's book biography, comes in as the background, but we read his writings inside and out in that class.
The thing that I noticed that surprised me about this is that the notion that the book was not noticed at the time is apparently false. The American Historical Association may not have reviewed, the HR may not have reviewed it, but it was well known at the time and people were responding to it.
That was mind blowing for me. Yeah.
Sound.
I think this is a great place for us to actually end our conversation this afternoon. This has been a wonderful panel discussion about an important work of history that I think we're going to see stay relevant for many, many years to come. You really cannot talk about Reconstruction historiography without talking about Black Reconstruction in America. And I think, as we've established this afternoon, you really can't talk about American historiography without talking about Black Reconstruction in America either. So I'd like everyone to thank our panelists, Doctors Hilary Green, Michael Fitzgerald, and Alaina Roberts, for a wonderful and passionate discussion. And please be on the lookout for future SHA virtual conversations about classic works of Southern history. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you again very soon. Until then, have a good rest of your day and a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Well, that was fun. Thank you. That was great fun. Hey, Hillary, it's nice to see you. You going down to the Southern in the fall?
Yes, I'll see you there.
I'll
I'm
see
gonna
you
log
there.
off. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good one, everyone. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
much. Bye-bye. That was fun.
Oh,
Have a
that was
good day.
great. You too.
Yeah. It worked. Okay, we can. I don't quite know how to get off here, so if you want to
You're
turn
good.
it,
Yeah, bottom right, there should be an end button or a leave.
hmm, hang on. Why am I not getting it? Oh, there it is. It was hidden by another icon.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you very much. You have a nice day.
Bye. You too.